All right, let's get into it. We're about to tackle one of the most intense, world-altering events in human history, the French Revolution. We're going to break down exactly how a centuries-old kingdom completely fell apart and gave rise to something entirely new.
So, I want you to picture this. It's July 14th, 1789. The streets of Paris are electric, but not in a good way. There's this palpable fear in the air. Whispers are spreading everywhere, and people are terrified, and that terror is right on the edge of exploding.
And this is the rumor that lights the fuse. The word on the street is that King Louis XVI is going to send in the army to slaughter everyone. And the people? Well, they decide that if they're going to go down, they're not going down without a fight.
So you have to ask, right? How did things get this bad? I mean, how does an entire country turn so completely against its own king, ready to rip down an institution that's been around for hundreds of years? That's the question we're here to answer.
You see, the French Revolution didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The kingdom was basically sitting on a giant powder keg of debt and injustice that had been packed tighter and tighter for years.
When Louis XVI came to power back in 1774, he inherited a kingdom that was, for all intents and purposes, completely broke. I mean, decades of war, including bankrolling the American Revolution, plus the insane spending at the Royal Palace of Versailles, had just drained the treasury dry. They were already 2 billion livres in debt, and the war tacked on another billion. And to make it even worse, lenders started demanding a crazy 10% interest rate.
Now, to really get what was going on, you have to understand how French society was built. It was split into these three rigid classes. They called them estates. First, you had the first estate, that's the clergy, all the church officials. Then came the second estate, the nobility. And the third estate, well, that was literally everyone else.
And this is where the injustice just becomes staggering. Look at this. The first two estates, a tiny little 3% of the population, owned over 60% of the land. And here's the kicker. They paid zero taxes. Nothing. The entire tax burden, 100% of it, fell on the third estate, the 97% of the people who had way less land and almost no wealth.
Oh, but it didn't stop there. Nope. On top of all the state taxes they had to pay, the third estate was also hit with something called the tithe. This was a religious tax that forced them to give a tenth of everything they grew straight to the church, which, remember, was the super wealthy first estate. The whole system was just designed to funnel money from the poor to the rich.
So, you've got a country about to go bankrupt, and a population that is just being crushed by inequality. That powder keg is ready to blow. All it needed was a spark, and that spark, it came from a whole new way of thinking.
For centuries, people just accepted the idea of the divine right of kings, the belief that the king got his power straight from God. But now, you had these Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau saying, wait a minute, they were pushing for a government based on freedom, equal laws, and the idea that a government can only rule if the people agree to it. They said a person's value should come from their talent, not their family name.
Okay, so back to the king. He knows the country is facing a total financial meltdown, and his only option is to raise taxes. But here's the thing. Ancient French law said he couldn't just do that on his own. So he was forced to do something that hadn't happened in 175 years. He called a meeting of the Estates General.
And this is the moment where everything just completely broke down. The issue was voting. So the first and second estates had about 300 representatives each, but the third estate had 600. The king wanted to use the old system, one vote per estate. It was a total trap, right? The clergy and the nobles would always team up and outvote the commoners 2-1. The third estate saw this coming and demanded one vote per person. The king said no.
That refusal? It was a massive mistake. The third estate was furious. They decided if they couldn't work within the system, they'd make a new one. And that's when the dominoes of the old French monarchy started to fall, one after another.
And man, things happened fast. On June 20th, the Third Estate found themselves locked out of their meeting hall. So they went to a nearby indoor tennis court and swore an oath, the famous tennis court oath, not to leave until they'd written a new constitution for France. They started calling themselves the National Assembly. Then, less than a month later, on July 14th, that rumor about the army starts, and they storm the Bastille prison looking for weapons. By August 4th, the National Assembly completely abolishes the entire feudal system, ending all the special privileges for the nobility. It was a total teardown of the old world.
So by 1791, the National Assembly finishes France's very first constitution, and it completely changed the game. It set up a constitutional monarchy where power was separated. You had a legislative branch, the Assembly, to make laws, a judiciary with courts to interpret them, and the king was left as the executive, but his power was seriously limited.
The Constitution also laid out basic rights for every citizen. I mean, these are things we might take for granted now, but back then, they were absolutely revolutionary. The right to life, freedom of speech and opinion, and maybe the biggest one of all, that everyone was equal in the eyes of the law.
But the king was not on board. He started secretly plotting with other kings in Europe to get his absolute power back. When the National Assembly found out, they declared war. All this patriotic war fever gave power to the more radical groups, like the Jacobins, who wanted the king gone for good. They pushed, and finally, on September 21st, 1792, they got their wish. The monarchy was officially abolished, and France was declared a republic.
So, what do you do with a king when you don't have a kingdom anymore? They put Louis XVI on trial. He was found guilty of treason against his own country and sentenced to die. On January 21st, 1793, he was publicly executed by the guillotine, an event that sent absolute shockwaves across every royal family in Europe.
The death of the king kicked off the most violent, the most chaotic, and the bloodiest phase of the entire revolution. It was a period that wouldn't end in a stable democracy, but with the rise of a new strongman, an emperor.
The new government, led by a radical Jacobin named Maximilien Robespierre, became completely consumed by paranoia. Anyone who was even suspected of being an enemy of the Republic, nobles, priests, even other revolutionaries who disagreed with him, was arrested, given a quick sham trial, and sent to the guillotine. Over the next year, tens of thousands of people were executed. This dark chapter became known as the Reign of Terror.
And yet, in the middle of all this bloodshed, the Jacobin government did something incredible. They made a landmark decision to abolish slavery in all the French colonies. You know, the places that supplied France with all its sugar, coffee, and tobacco, all built on the backs of enslaved people. It was this truly remarkable act of liberty, born out of the revolution's highest ideals, even as it descended into its darkest moment.
But the terror just couldn't sustain itself. Robespierre's methods were too extreme, and he made enemies everywhere, even among his own supporters. Eventually, they all turned on him. In July of 1794, Robespierre himself was arrested, branded a traitor, and met the exact same fate as the thousands he had sent to the guillotine.
After Robespierre's fall, France was just a mess. The new government was weak, it was corrupt, and this created a massive power vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped a brilliant, ambitious young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. He saw his opening. In 1799, he seized power. By 1804, he'd thrown away the whole idea of a republic and crowned himself emperor. His reign would last until his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815.
Which leaves us with a really tough question. The French Revolution gave the world these incredible modern ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But it came at the cost of years of terror, war, and chaos, which just led to another dictator. It's a complicated legacy, and it's something worth thinking about. Was it all worth the price?